Have you ever poured water into a small garden drain and watched it sit there instead of disappearing the way it should? I have made the mistake of ignoring that little warning myself, and by the time I finally looked at the opening, there was a packed layer of dirt leaves and old plant material sitting right where the water needed to pass. Most people see that and immediately reach for a strong cleaner or some expensive product from the store, but for a small accessible blockage I have learned to start much more simply. There is an old household method using Coca-Cola and ordinary baking soda that can sometimes help loosen light residue around a small drainage opening, and today I want to show you exactly how I approach it without pretending that it can solve every kind of blockage. The first thing I want you to remember is that the bubbles are not the real goal. The real goal is getting water to move freely again. That sounds obvious, but it is where many people go wrong because they see a big reaction and assume the drain must be completely clean. I learned years ago that a little fizz can be useful, but it does not tell you what is happening farther down the passage. If the problem is just loose dirt, fine soil, or old residue near the entrance, this simple method may help disturb it enough for you to finish the job with a soft brush and clean water. If there is a stone, a root, a solid piece of debris, or a deeper restriction, then I do not keep pouring more ingredients into the opening and hoping for a miracle. I stop and find the real cause. That small difference has saved me more time and money than any cleaning product I have ever bought. So before we pour anything, I want to show you the first step that most people skip, and it is probably the most important part of the whole method, because if you miss it, you may be treating the wrong problem from the very beginning. The reason I stopped treating every little garden blockage with strong cleaners is simple, because most small blockages are not really deep blockages at all. They are often just a little plug of soil dust plant pieces and old residue sitting right at the opening. I remember one drain beside an old planter that looked completely finished because water would sit there for several minutes before moving away. My first thought was that something must be packed deep inside the pipe. But when I checked the opening, I found a thin layer of dirt pressed against it like a little stopper. That taught me something I still follow today. Before you try to force a blockage deeper into a drain, you should first try to loosen what is actually sitting at the entrance. This is where Coca-Cola and baking soda can be useful as a simple household method for a small, accessible opening. Coca-Cola is acidic, and baking soda is alkaline, so when they meet, you get that familiar fizzing reaction. The fizz can help disturb loose dirt and residue around the opening, but I want to be clear about what this method can and cannot do. It is not a miracle cleaner, and it is not something I would use for a serious blockage deep inside a pipe. If a stone is stuck inside, or a root has grown into the passage, or a thick mass of soil has packed the drain, then I do not keep pouring more ingredients into it and hoping for a different result. That only wastes time. The old method works best when the opening is small, the blockage is light, and you can reach the area easily. There's another reason I prefer starting gently, especially around the garden. Garden drains and planter openings can be close to living roots and surrounding soil, and I do not want to use a harsh product simply because the water is moving slowly. Sometimes the cheapest approach is also the easiest because you can see exactly what is happening. I usually begin by removing every loose piece I can reach with my fingers or a soft brush. Only after that do I consider the Coca-Cola and baking soda. And this is where one small mistake matters more than most people realize, because if you mix everything together too early, the reaction happens before it reaches the place you actually want to clean. What I learned from that old gardener was that the order matters more than the amount. He never dumped everything into a hole and waited for a big reaction. He first cleared what he could see, then he used a small amount of Coca-Cola, and only after it had reached the dirt and residue around the opening did he add a little baking soda. That was the part that made sense to me, because the goal was never to make the biggest fizz possible. The goal was to loosen what was sitting in the small passage. I remember the first time I tried it on a garden drain beside an old planter. I had already removed the leaves and loose soil, but the water was still moving slowly. I added a small amount of cola and waited a little while. Then I added the baking soda, and the reaction started right away. You could hear the soft fizzing and see the surface moving, but what interested me was what happened after the bubbles settled. The material around the opening was easier to disturb with a soft brush. That was the result I wanted. I could work around the edge without forcing anything deeper into the drain. Most people make the mistake of seeing the bubbles and thinking the bubbles themselves are cleaning the whole drain. I do not look at it that way. The reaction happens where the two materials meet, so I use it only as a way to help loosen light residue that I can already reach. If the opening is close to a vegetable plant, I keep the amount very small because I do not want sugary liquid spreading through the surrounding soil. I am cleaning the opening, not feeding the garden with soda. This is also why I do not use the method repeatedly just because I enjoy watching it fizz. Once the reaction has finished, I rinse the opening with plain clean water and watch what happens. If the water disappears easily, then I know the blockage was probably close to the surface. If it rises again or moves very slowly, then I have learned something more important. The real restriction may be farther inside, and that is where the simple kitchen method reaches its limit. I learned that lesson after cleaning the same opening more than once and getting exactly the same result. The entrance looked clean, but the water still would not move properly, and that told me I was looking in the wrong place. That little test changed how I handle these jobs now because the next step is not more soda or more cola. It is finding out what is actually stopping the water. The next step is the one I pay the most attention to because this is where a simple trick can either stay useful or turn into a messy job. After I have removed the loose dirt and plant pieces from the opening, I let the area settle for a moment, and then I use a small amount of Coca-Cola directly around the accessible part of the blockage. I do not pour a large bottle into the garden because there is no reason to soak the surrounding soil with a sugary drink. I want just enough to reach the residue that is still sitting around the opening. I learned this small habit from an older gardener who had been maintaining his own garden for years, and he always told me that when a job is small, you should use a small amount first. That sounds simple, but most people do the opposite. They see a slow drain and immediately think more liquid must mean better cleaning. I have found that it usually means more mess instead. Once the cola has had a little time to reach the dirt and residue, I add a small amount of baking soda. The familiar fizz starts almost immediately, and this is the moment when most people get excited because it looks like something powerful is happening. But I do not judge the method by the amount of foam. I watch the material around the opening. If the blockage is only light, the reaction can help loosen the residue enough that I can work it gently with a soft brush or rinse it away with clean water. That is the result I am looking for. I am not trying to push a blockage farther down the drain. I am trying to make the material at the entrance easier to remove. There's another little detail I learned the hard way. If you are doing this beside a vegetable bed or planter, I keep the mixture confined to the drain opening and avoid spreading it across the soil. I do not want sugary residue sitting around the roots or attracting insects. Once the fizzing has stopped, I rinse the opening with plain water and then I wait. This waiting is important because it tells me much more than the bubbles did. If the water disappears freely, I know the small blockage was probably close to the surface. If the water still stands there or quickly slows again, then I know I have reached the limit of this simple method. And that is where the next lesson begins, because a clean opening does not always mean a clear drain. There is one mistake I see people make again and again when they try a simple drain cleaning method, and that is assuming that a reaction means the job is finished. I learned not to trust the bubbles alone. What matters is what the water does afterward. Once the fizzing has stopped, I rinse the opening with plain water and watch it closely. If the water starts moving away quickly and the level drops normally, then I know I probably had a small amount of loose residue near the entrance. But if the water rises again almost immediately, then I do not add another round of Coca-Cola and baking soda. That is where patience becomes more useful than another household trick. I take a small brush or a piece of flexible material that cannot easily break, and I gently check the opening again. Sometimes I find another layer of leaves or soil sitting just below the surface. This is something very few people do because they are already expecting the first treatment to solve everything. I have found that removing the loosened material is often more important than creating a stronger reaction. You are not trying to win a battle with the drain. You are simply giving the water a clear path. Another little detail matters when the drain is connected to a garden area. I make sure the water I rinse through the opening is moving toward its normal drainage point and not back toward a vegetable bed or a place where it can sit around plant roots. A blocked drain is annoying, but standing water around plants can become a much bigger problem. I also avoid using this method on a large or completely blocked drainage system where I cannot see what is happening. If there is a deep blockage, I want to know what caused it rather than covering the problem with more liquid. Sometimes the real culprit is a compacted layer of soil. Sometimes it is a small stone. Sometimes roots have found their way into a narrow opening. None of those problems are going to disappear because the mixture fizzed for a few seconds. This is the old lesson I keep coming back to. Use the simple method when the problem is simple, and stop when the evidence tells you it is not. But there is one final check I always make before I call the job finished, because a drain can look perfectly clear at the top and still fail the next time it rains. And that is where many gardeners discover the problem too late. The final check I make is very simple, and it does not cost anything, because I want to know whether the drain is really clear before I forget about it and move on with the rest of the garden. I slowly pour clean water into the opening and watch how it leaves. I am not looking for a dramatic rush of water. I am looking for steady movement without the water sitting around the opening or backing up again. If it drains normally, I give the area one more gentle rinse and remove anything that has collected around the edge. This little habit has saved me from having to repeat the same job later because sometimes the first rinse carries loose dirt toward another narrow point, and the water slows again. Most people walk away as soon as the first bit of water disappears, but I like to test it one more time because a garden drain has to work when there is more water than just a cup poured from a bucket. If the drain is connected to a small outdoor channel, I will pour a little more clean water through it and watch where that water goes. I want to see that it reaches the proper outlet and does not simply disappear under a layer of soil where it can create a wet spot around the roots of nearby plants. This is especially important after heavy rain because that is when a small restriction can become a much larger problem. There is another old habit I have kept for years, and it has nothing to do with Coca-Cola or baking soda. I check the drain before the rainy season and again after a few strong storms. I remove leaves and loose soil while the problem is still small instead of waiting until water is standing around my feet. That little bit of prevention is usually easier than cleaning a completely blocked opening, and if I notice that the same drain keeps slowing down even after I clean the visible material, then I stop using household mixtures and look for the reason. A repeated blockage can be a sign that something deeper needs attention, and adding more ingredients will not change that. The real saving comes from knowing when a simple method is enough and when it is time to stop. That is what I like about this approach, because it does not require expensive products or complicated equipment. You use what you already have for a small accessible problem, and then let the result tell you what to do next. But there is still one part of this little routine that I always finish with, because it can make the difference between fixing the drain today and keeping it clear for the rest of the season. The part I never skip now is keeping the opening clean after the blockage is gone, because that is what makes this simple job worth doing in the first place. Once the drain is flowing normally, I remove any remaining leaves, dirt, or plant pieces from around the opening and give the area a final rinse with plain water. I do not leave Coca-Cola or baking soda sitting around the garden simply because the cleaning part is finished. I want the drain clean and the surrounding soil left as normal as possible. Then, I take a moment to look at the area and ask myself a simple question. Why did it block in the first place? If leaves keep falling into the opening, I may place a small piece of mesh over it. If soil is washing into the drain, I may adjust the edge or add a little cover so the next rain does not carry another load of dirt inside. This is the part that many people overlook because fixing the blockage feels like the end of the job. For me, it is actually the beginning of keeping the problem from coming back. I remember how many times I used to clean the same drain over and over because I was only treating the symptom. Once I started looking at what was entering the opening, the whole job became much easier. A few minutes of prevention can save an afternoon of cleaning later. And that is really what I like about these old simple methods. They do not require a special machine or an expensive bottle from the garden center. You use a small amount of ordinary household ingredients for a small problem, and then you finish the job with something even simpler, which is observation. If the water flows freely, you are done. If it slows again, you look deeper instead of repeating the same treatment. If there is a solid obstruction or a deeper blockage you deal with, that cause directly rather than expecting a kitchen mixture to solve it. That way, you stay in control, and you do not waste money on products you may never need. So, the next time you see a small garden drain beginning to slow down, do not wait until rain turns it into a flooded mess. Clear the loose material first. Then, if the opening is suitable, try the small Coca-Cola and baking soda method carefully and watch what the water tells you afterward. Sometimes the oldest lessons are the simplest ones. Start small. Use what you already have. Watch the result and stop when the job is done. And once you get into the habit of checking these little openings before every heavy rain, you may find that you spend far less time fighting drainage problems and far more time simply enjoying the garden.